control at this point.
All right, so now we are broadcasting. All right. So you guys should have the participants button down at the bottom so you can see.
Yep.
All right. Well, we're going to get started. We're still waiting on a few, but they can join us later. Welcome everyone to our third QAM webinar. My name is Laura Browarny. I am the annual meeting team lead on the QAM board. Unfortunately, we weren't able to have our annual meeting this year, so we are bringing you these series of webinars, many of which are taken from QAM sessions that had been accepted, and we've turned them digital. So two of our presenters here, we're going to present separately at QAM in April, but we've brought them together along with Emily to do a super duper interpretation presentation for you guys, which I am super excited about. I will introduce them in a second, but I want to, before we even get started, just pop up a little poll here to get an idea of your familiarity with interpretation, just so all of these ladies have an idea of, you know, how basic we need to get with some of our terms and definitions. So I'm just going to throw this up there right now. This is anonymous, so be honest. If you have no idea what interpretation is, please let us know.
And we can't vote, Laura, so we can't even bias our own poll, right?
Oh, I didn't. I forgot.
It's totally fine. It just says hosts and panelists can't vote. So like, that's fine.
So we have, so far, 4 CIGs with us.
Excellent.
All right, so let me share these results with everyone. Looks like we're pretty well dispersed. The majority of people have heard of interpretation, but don't know much about it, which is perfect for us. We do have a few guides with us, and for our one person who has not heard of interpretation, you are in for a treat. I always tell people, if you have to interact with humans at your museum, then you should learn about interpretation. So that's how I always sell it. So I'm going to turn it over to our 3 presenters. We have Catherine Mercer, who is actually here in my building with me. She is the Museum Education Coordinator here for the Town of Windsor Museums, and she's also a Certified Interpretive Guide trainer. Karen Hostetter is the owner of Interpret This. She is all of the interpretation certifications. I was going to list them all, but I'll let you do that if you want. And then Emily Jacobs is actually joining us from NAI. That's the National Association for Interpretation, and she is the Manager of Certification and Training.
Yes, absolutely.
Close.
Yes.
Excellent. So I am pretty much going to disappear, and if you have questions throughout, please put those in the Q&A area, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. They will try to answer as many as they can throughout the presentation, but don't worry if they don't get to it. We will save room at the end for those questions. If you are going to give us some feedback, or if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to use the chat section for that one. But it's a lot easier for us to manage questions in the Q&A. So try and use that one as much as you can for questions. And without any further ado, I'm gonna let these ladies take it over.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so you will all see our beautiful PowerPoint popping up here. There we go. All right, so our presentation is called Applying the Basics of Interpretation to Programming and Writing. We 3 are the presenters. A couple of goals for the session were to have you guys have a basic understanding of how to apply some principles of interpretation to both program planning and organizational writing. So we'll be looking at both aspects today. And then also we have Emily here with us to talk to us about acquiring professional certification through NAI. So it's going to be a fun day. We have some interactive questions for you guys, so we are pretty excited. Polls, did we have other polls we wanted to go out here?
Yeah, Laura should have a few.
All right, Laura, I believe you have a couple more poll questions for us. We have some more polls for you all because we love polls.
Do you want Catherine's poll or Karen's polls?
Ones that I sent you.
Yes, the ones that Karen sent.
Gotcha. Let me pull it up. I think I can't do it if Catherine is sharing her screen.
I could stop sharing.
Try that. It is not showing me my other polls. All right.
Keep going and you can work on it. And if
Yeah,
you
don't worry about it. It's not
Yeah.
that critical if it doesn't happen.
Yes, keep going, and I'll let you know if I find
That's-
it.
All right, we're back on our PowerPoint.
Thank you for that
some poll
information.
questions. Yes. So we're going to do just a really fast overview of some of the sort of foundations of interpretation, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. So we pulled out for you all the National Association for Interpretation definition, which is interpretation is a mission-based communication process that forges emotional and intellectual connections between the interests of the audience and the meanings inherent in the resource. So there's some great words in there that we're going to be pulling out during the presentation, but that's basically the basic definition. We also wanted to go over with you all Freeman Tilden's principles of interpretation. So if you're not familiar with Freeman Tilden, he was a fabulous man who he was a journalist for a while. He went to work for the National Park Service, and he wrote a brilliant book called Interpreting Our Heritage, which came out in 1967. And in it, he writes the 6 principles that sort of guide interpretation. And this was really groundbreaking for the time. He was one of the first people to sort of look at all these principles and come up with the term interpretation and sort of put down in writing what we should be doing. So his first principle was that any interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or experience of the visitor will be sterile. That's a long way of saying that if you can't relate what you're saying to something within the brain of the person you're talking to, if they can't connect to it in any way, it's not going to mean anything to them. So as interpreters, we all want to make meaning. We can do that by relating our subject matter to them. And I pulled out 2 things for that we're going to fit underneath this first principle and talk about more throughout this presentation. The first one is audiences. I don't need to define an audience. These are the people who are coming to your programs and events. And then the other thing that we use to relate our subject matter to the people coming to our programs and events are called tangibles. So these are the objects at your museum, your building itself, the different things you have in your museum that you use to talk to your visitors. So these are things you can touch, you can feel them, they're tangible. But then we also relate our tangibles to our visitors using intangibles. So these are things that we can't necessarily touch. They are abstract concepts. So they can be things like feelings or values. So happiness, joy, family, that sort of thing. So things that if I say family, we probably can all relate to the idea of a family in some way, no matter what way that is. Same thing with something like joy, that sort of thing. So we'll be talking more about that, but that's the quick definition. The second principle is information as such is not interpretation. Interpretation is revelation based upon information, but they are entirely different things. All interpretation includes information. So thinking about going beyond information, I'm sure that we've all gone to programs and events at different sites where it's like an information overload and you're really interested, but you just can only take in so much information at once. So interpretation talks a lot about going beyond just the presentation of information and making it a revelation that the audience can connect to. All right, moving on really quickly. Interpretation number 3 talks about how principle number 3 talks about how interpretation is an art, which combines many arts, whether the materials presented are scientific, historical, or architectural. Any art is in some degree teachable. And I love that because so many times, you know, you have an obscure historical figure, or you have a random building, or you have an object in your collection, and you're like, how am I going to get people to learn about this? But I love the idea that interpretation, just the fact of communicating to the public about what we have in our museums, is an art, and any art is teachable. So we as interpreters can make anything teachable. It's a wonderful idea. And then principle number 4 is that the chief aim of interpretation is not instruction, but provocation. So as interpreters, our goal is to provoke people to do something, to take some sort of action. So we don't want them to just come to the tour, go home, and never think about it again. Some people do that, but our goal is to get them to have some sort of action. So become members of the museum, donate money, come to a program we're having next month, whatever it happens to be, not throwing trash in a park, whatever it is. And the way that we do that, the way that we as interpreters attempt to get people to do some sort of action, is through having what's called a theme in our presentation. So I'm going to talk more about themes in a second, but it's basically the big idea that connects your audience to the subject matter. So whatever you want them to go away with at the end of the presentation, like that big thing you want them to remember, that's what your theme is going to be. Tangibles and intangibles, which we talked about a little bit ago, and then universals, which are basically intangibles, but things that literally anyone in the world, intangible with a big I, that anyone can relate to. So we will look at those in the next couple of slides, but first, just touching really quickly on his last 2 guiding principles of interpretation. Interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part, and it must address itself to the whole man or person rather than any phase. And then number 6, interpretation addressed to children should not be a dilution of the presentation to adults, but should follow a fundamentally different approach. To be at its best, it will require a separate program. So again, Tilden is touching on audience here, thinking about if we have different kinds of audience members, how do we relate it to them? Should it be different? So he was one of the first people to sort of look at that in interpretation and really think about how our audiences affect what we're doing. So is like the 30-second run through of Freeman Tilden's principles of interpretation. But what all these principles are doing, and what the field of interpretation seeks to do, is answer this burning question that I know we've all had when we go to different museums and events and programs, which is, so what? Why does what I'm hearing, or why does what I'm looking at matter to me? And interpretation seeks to answer this so what question. Because if a person cares about something, if you really care about something, if you can connect to it, if you can relate to it, you are way more likely to do something about that thing. So if you care about the forest that you're camping in, you're much less likely to leave all your trash behind at the end of the day. You're going to cart it out with you. So as interpreters, our goal, remember, is to provoke that sort of action, to get people to care, and that caring will cause them to act, and that's what we want to do. So that's what the goal of interpretation is, and we do this through tangibles, intangibles, and universals. So again, intangibles are those elements that connect the audience to your tangibles. So I put an example here on the screen. Here at the Town of Windsor Museums, we have an 1880s train depot, and inside the train depot we have a lovely little telephone. And last summer I thought for the longest time, how can I get people, it's a telephone, how can I connect people to a telephone? So I thought, okay, telephone's my tangible object. What are the intangible and universal elements I can pull off of this? So this is something like community, the telephone connected the community, communication, joy, family, love, all these things that we communicate through a telephone, especially right now in the situation that we're in. And so I came up with the statement, this telephone connected our community through times of joy and loss. So right there, it's a little bit more interesting than just saying, this is a telephone that was used by a lot of people here in Windsor. You might think, oh, that's interesting. But this one, I think it sort of gets you thinking more like, oh, what were these times of joy and loss? Who were the people who used it? How did it connect our community? It also gives a launching point for the interpreter to be like, you're part of this community too. How does your telephone connect you? And sort of relate the object, the telephone that they're looking at, to their own lived experience. So the statement that I just gave for you guys, this telephone connected our community through times of joy and loss, is an example of a theme. And so themes are the main idea of your program or event. They're one of the central tenets of interpretation. So having a theme throughout your entire program is super important, because that's the statement that's going to have your tangibles and your intangibles and connect your audience to what you're saying. So a theme is not a topic. A lot of times you want to say like, oh, my presentation is technology themed, but technology in the instance of interpretation would be your topic. Your topic is technology, but your theme would be this sentence about the telephone. So it's not just a topic, it's going beyond that to think, how am I connecting to my audience? How am I connecting those tangibles and intangibles? When my audience goes home at the end of the day, what's that thing that I want them to remember with those intangibles in it that can like stick in their brain because they remember it because it relates to them. So that in a quick nutshell is an example of a theme. We're going to be talking more about those throughout the presentation. So that was like a marathon sprint through some of the foundational principles of interpretation. If anyone has any questions about those, feel free to leave them in the chat box and we can respond to you. So does anyone, Karen and Emily, do you guys have anything you want to add about interpretation? All right, we will keep on going. So I am going to talk to you guys a little bit about building community using interpretation to plan museum programming. So I am the museum educator here for the Town of Windsor Museums. I've been in museum education for, what is time anymore, about 8-9 years now. I was trained as a certified interpretive guide through NAI at the Aspen Historical Society, learned a lot there. And then I went to Kansas City and I was the museum educator at the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures for about 6.5 years. And I came here to Colorado, where I'm from originally, and now I'm with Windsor. So it's been a really interesting career because I've worked at an art museum, more of a heavily art museum, and now it's sort of a history, science-based area. So I've sort of gotten to get my hands wet in both areas. So, but something that I've used, no matter if you're in an art museum, science museum, history museum, no matter where you are, if you cover all of those, if you cover none of those and cover something totally different, you can use interpretation to plan your museum programming. So if you guys are anything like me, at the beginning of the year, your planner looked like this, or at least you had a planner with a basic idea of maybe what programs you were doing this year. You thought, maybe I'll do this summer. Maybe in April, I'll do this program. But then all of a sudden, in early March, our planners looked more like this, which is what's going on? What do we do? Everything's pretty crazy now. It's all up in the air. I had to cancel all of my programs. It's, you know, all my planning was for nothing. Kind of this feeling of panic. So I have a poll question for you guys. Laura, do I need to stop? Oh, no, there's my poll. All right, you guys can answer this poll question that just popped up on the screen. Have you had to cancel a program or event that you were excited about because of the COVID-19 pandemic? All right, so 90% of us said that we did have to cancel, and then 10% said that they were able to postpone it, which is great. But yeah, 90% of us had to cancel a program. That's really, I mean, for me at least, as a museum educator, it was sad, you know, we have things we're excited about. We've spent time planning, and now it's just all gone. And so for me, my first feeling that I had about this was just, what's next? Honestly, I was like really panicked for like a week because we all put so much work into the things we're doing. All of you guys are fabulous museum people. You put time and effort into this, and then now what's next, you know? And so my very first gut reaction was like, I need to get stuff online. I need to do it now. I had to do it yesterday. And so I ran out with a little camera and some other staff members, and we did these little videos that we put on the Town of Windsor Facebook page. And they are not the best edited videos, but I was at the time was like, okay, this is what's important. I just need to get content out. Does it really matter what the content is? Panic, 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 panic. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that feeling, but that was definitely me for like the first 2 weeks of March. So we put these videos up. They had little questions and stuff and activities that kids were supposed to do, but nobody really responded in the comments. We didn't get a lot of interaction with the videos. So I'm not sure they were the most successful thing, but they were kind of that knee-jerk reaction of we have to do something, right? And then after those videos were posted, I was kind of like, okay, I got some videos out. Is this, the best thing for me to be doing right now? Or are there other things I could be doing? And so I went back to my drawing board of interpretation and I took some deep breaths. So I found this great stock photo of this man lying in a field. So let's all pretend that the man is our museum educator or museum person or interpreter. And they're just kind of sprawled out in this field like, oh, what am I doing? And they are crushing all of the programs and events and things they had coming up under them. Those are all gone now. But you'll notice around the outstretched arms are some different flowers. Some of those flowers are closer. You can kind of grab them. Some of them he'd have to reach for, they're further away. But I'd like to think that all those flowers around him are different program opportunities that we have, especially now. And interpretation is sort of the guiding pathway that we can use to decide what we're going to do and kind of have that deep breath of being able to plan and think about what we're going to do going forward. So I wanted to take you guys through sort of the planning process that I've used over the last month for my programs. I've used it before the last month too. I've always had this planning process in place for like 6 years now. But I just wanted to take you guys through kind of that, the process that I went through from panic, do anything to, I have these foundations I can draw on. Here's how we can move forward in the future. So just pulling out the definition from NAI again, I bolded some of the words that I think are really important here for interpretation. So those are mission-based. Interpretation is a mission-based communication process. It forms connections between your audience and the meanings that are in whatever it is that you're talking about. So thinking about these important things with interpretation and how I use them to plan, the very first thing I do is go back to the mission, which I tend to forget about a lot. You're out there running around, you're doing things, but going back and checking in with your mission can be so, so important. And even if you work for an organization that doesn't have a mission, or maybe your mission is not clear, even just having a personal mission of creating that to give yourself that foundation too. So the Town of Windsor Museum's mission is to build community through creativity and discovery. So the first thing I did is I went and I wrote this at the top of a piece of paper. My goal, the reason why I'm here at this museum is to build community through creativity and discovery. And that sort of gave me my launching off point, helped me move a little bit from that panic. The other thing interpretation does is forges connections. It connects those tangible physical elements to universal concepts, so those emotions and big ideas that anyone can relate to. And what this does is it makes your subject matter relatable. And this is something I really struggled with for the first couple of weeks of this pandemic, because I thought, I talk about train depots and I talk about sugar beets, and is any of this relatable? Does the audience need any of this? But there's things that you can do to make anything that you're talking about relatable to your audience. You can find a theme that will connect your audience. And the way I like to start doing this is to take whatever it is you think you want to talk about. So in my instance, this thing was sugar beets. Like, how can I talk about sugar beets? How will my audience connect to this thing they may not have heard of? A lot of people don't know that our sugar beets make sugar, especially here in Colorado. So how can I connect people to this? And then I make a word cloud around that of all the ideas and beliefs and those intangible things that the object represents. So for me, sugar beets represent survival. All the German from Russian immigrants coming to Colorado in the early 1900s used the sugar beets as a way to survive. They were able to find employment and a life here in Colorado because of sugar beets. You know, what is that thing allowing us to survive today? That sort of idea. Our train depot, I did a huge word cloud for this one, and I came up with the idea of opportunities. People have been coming to Windsor in search of opportunities. There's different opportunities here in the town, and there have been since 1882 when the train depot was built. So people came to that depot looking for a new life, looking for opportunities. You know, what brings you here? What are you going through in your life? That sort of thing. So I would recommend, if you're sort of like stuck, like, well, how can my audience relate to this thing that I'm talking about? Do a word cloud with those tangibles and intangibles, and it can be really helpful. The other thing interpretation does is it considers the audience. So here at the Windsor Museum, we had pretty well-defined audiences. You can see them up here on the screen. People who are interested in local history, families who want educational activities, adults looking for fun outings, school groups. But my then thought was, but who in the world are audiences now that this pandemic is going on? And what do they want? How have their motivations changed? And since the videos hadn't worked out very well, I went ahead and I reached out to my audiences. So I have a local teacher I was working closely with. I have a activity director at a residential facility that we work with, and then also a parent who attends their kids attend almost all of our programs. And I asked them, like, what could we do? Just, is there anything we can do? This is a really tough time. What can we do? And the teacher told me really interestingly, I would like to use your guys' videos that you pulled up, but on our teaching website where we upload all of our information, I can't submit Facebook links to the upload software. So I was like, oh, okay. So you couldn't even use our videos that we put up. And then the parent told me, I want my kids to feel like things are as normal as possible. So searching for that sense of normality. And then the activity director told me we're all pretty cooped up and we could use a distraction. So just having those three basic foundations gave me sort of a roadmap of things that I could do to plan programs in the future. So putting it all together, I have a very long planning document that incorporates the interpretive principles that we've talked about, and also parts of a book called Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. So this is largely a book that a lot of teachers use. It's a curriculum sort of planning book that basically says you need to start planning your curriculum and your lessons from sort of a bottom-up approach. So you need to come up with those core foundational understandings that you want the kids to learn, and then you plan your program off of those understandings. So Understanding by Design. I highly recommend reading that book. If you don't have access to it, just let me know. And my planning document, so it incorporates things from Understanding by Design, interpretive principles. It was first compiled by Laura Taylor, who's the curator of interpretation at the National Museum of Toys and Miniatures. And then I have sort of edited it for my use here at the Town of Windsor Museum. So I wanted to share that with all of you guys because it's helpful. I know it's a long document, but it's helpful to see everything in one place. This is a document that I wrote last year for a cemetery tour that I did here in Windsor. And I write one of these documents for every single program that I do. Adult programs, family nights, school groups, everything, because I think it's so important to start with those foundational understandings, and that gives you the guide to know what you want to do. So you can see I start off with the mission. It's right at the top of every document. I go into goals and objectives. So what do I actually want to accomplish with this program? I knew I wanted to do a cemetery tour. What am I accomplishing? So my goals are broad general intentions. I wanted to attract new people to the museum, cultivate a specific audience, and increase community awareness. My objectives, so these are the ways that I would accomplish those goals. It's basically have a cemetery tour that does these things. But going below that, you can see a part for themes. So once you have your mission, you know what your mission is, and once you have your goals, you know you want to attract new visitors, you want to increase awareness, whatever your goals are for your specific institution, you can then write themes and desired understandings for those. So these are the transferable big ideas that connect tangibles to universals and help the audience relate to the topic. And I thought it could be Windsor's past residents face similar struggles and triumphs as the ones you and I encountered today. Lakeview Cemetery shows how the local community has always been invested in caring for Windsor's past, scandal, love, education, and the search for a better life inspired and connected early Windsor residents. So right away, those are sort of the ins that I thought I could use to have people relate to the program. And I came up with some essential questions based off of those. So essential questions are an understanding by design concept. So these, questions that are going to guide viewer inquiry, they really focus how the person is learning and what they're learning about. So you can see my questions there. It's, what mark will you leave? Who was the first person buried here? Anything that's going to kind of guide your visitors to a deeper understanding of your topic. And then last but not least is the audience. So I identify specific audiences that I want to target for this. One of them, even in my goal, was Windsor residents interested in area history, and then adults 18 plus seeking fun activities, and facilitators, both socializing facilitators, so people out with friends, and then facilitating parents, so parents with kids who want educational things. So that told me right there, that guided me a lot. If I want to have tours for kids and I want to have tours for parents, how do I do that? I have one earlier and I have one later. So it kind of narrows it down. It helps me figure out the specifics. So that's sort of the meat and potatoes of the planning document. And you can see how I just go through, I write down the mission, I come up with goals and objectives. Those help to inform my themes, what I want the people to know. And then I have essential questions, and those are going to help me structure the actual program. And of course, audience, I'm considering it all along. Really quickly, I mentioned this is a long program planning document, so I just threw up the last 3 pages of this for you up on the screen. If anyone is interested in getting this document from me, I'm happy to send it to you. My email address is going to be at the end of this presentation. But it just includes all of the planning information that's in one place. So if I get hit by a bus next week, somebody knows where all this stuff is. The other thing is that I email this to myself after every single when I'm done writing it, and then I save it in an email folder. And then it doesn't matter if there's suddenly a global pandemic and you can't go into your work computer. If you can access your work email, you have all of your vendor information, volunteer phone numbers, contact information, that sort of thing. So this goes into everything from attendance, what I wanted my attendance to be, who's in charge of the program, if I have any presenters, their contact information, if I have vendors, their contact information, schedule, admission, if I'm working with anyone in the community, if I got grants for it, the exact marketing I want to happen for it, design work that will need to be done. And then on the last page, I have a page for final attendance and observations. So these are things that happen during the program that I might want to change for next year, or general observations that I had. So it's just everything's in one place, and you start off with those big goals and objectives, and then those allow you to get down into the nitty-gritty of all of this. So just taking you through my process really quickly, and especially what I've sort of been doing in the last couple of months since the pandemic. First, starting with your mission. That's the most important thing. If the program doesn't align with the mission, if you're kind of like, is this the best thing to be doing? Should you do it? Or is there something that will better align with your mission that will that you can do? And then, have I identified my audience and discovered what their motivations are? So have their motivations changed? What do they need? If you haven't identified your audience or talked to them or found out what their motivations are, how can you do that? Something I recommend is reaching out to your contacts. Do you have a teacher you work with a lot? Do you have someone in the community you work with? You can also read posts on Nextdoor or community groups. The local moms group here was like, we need something for our kids to do. Like just anything to occupy their time. And so that kind of gave me a good idea of, okay, well, I can come up with something to occupy kids' time. And then thinking, okay, I know my mission, I know my audience, what are the themes that I'm gonna use to connect my audience to what I'm talking about that will make them, be provoked to do some sort of action, attending future programs, whatever that would be. So, building a new program. I took all of these interpretive foundations and I came up with a new program. So since I talked to my audience, I realized that they wanted, especially parents, wanted their kids to have some sort of structure and normal activity to do right now. So something that would allow their children to feel more normal. And I decided to do an online after-school art workshop with an easily accessible theme. So here at the museum, we do a weekly after-school art workshop for kids. And a lot of those tend to have themes that are like, you know, modern art, that sort of thing. But I decided that since we want kids to feel normal, we want kids to be easily connected to it, I picked an easily accessible theme, which is toys. So we are designing toys. And then I thought, I don't want the parents to have to provide materials. That's stressful for them. You know, where are they going to find glue if they don't have glue? I made kits for them to pick up in advance so that kids can discover art and history at home. So you can see how I took the same things on the other planning document and was able to use it to plan future programs. So the mission is still the same. No matter what happens, that's our mission. Goals and objectives, just what I said, I want to create a sense of normalcy for kids, educate the community, and foster discovery and community even in difficult times. So sort of forwarding our mission even when it's hard. And then establishing a form of revenue during shutdown. I wanted to experiment and see, you know, if I charge a very small fee, will people pay? What will happen with that? And then the objective was to facilitate our weekly art program. I wanted kids to understand that toys are our forever friends. Every toy tells a story through its design, and I can make beautiful and fun things at home. You know, just because you're at home and you're not in your school art classroom or you're not at the museum in our art classroom here, you can still do things at home. You know, you can still be a normal kid having fun. So those were my themes, the understandings that I came up with, essential questions off of that. So why are certain toys popular? What do my favorite toys say about me and what I like? How do I design and create different toys? So kind of guiding the program there. And then the audience was specifically kids in school between the ages of 6 through 12. But I had a specific marketing audience of parents looking for educational activities for their kids. So those same parents that were out there like, I just want some activity to do for my kids, those are the parents that I want to target with this. I did have a page 2, 3, and 4 for this as well. I didn't include it on here because it was a lot of like, here's how the Zoom link works. So to sum all of this up, if you remember the picture of the guy just kind of sprawled out on the grass with all those flowers around him, I think even in this time of uncertainty and even on my end panic, it's still possible to find your programmatic flowers. So there's things around you that you can do. And I just want to say, take time for yourself. You know, this is mentally hard on all of us, but you've got this. You know, we are museum people and we can come up with programs that will connect to our communities because we have so many toolkits we can use, one of them being the interpretive toolkit of thinking about your audience, coming up with a theme to connect your audience to what you're saying, remembering to include your mission, and relating your things to your audience. So these don't have to be super high-tech things that you do. You can see in the photo on the right, my super legit setup for my after-school art workshops. So it's literally a laptop on a folding table, and I walk the kids through the project that we're doing. And then for the teacher who had said, well, I'd love to, you know, have history lessons for my kids, but I can't upload Facebook links, I made print materials that I emailed to her, and then the whole class was able to do it all together with photos and different activities within the guide. And then for the residential nursing home director, I came up with the idea of making paper flowers for May Day, having a little activity card of like, where can you put your flower? What flowers do you love? That sort of thing for every resident in the facility, and got some really cute photos back about residents and what they did with their flowers. I love this one, which is on a tractor. So just thinking like my first, you know, we all want to go out there and we all want to be doing things, but make sure that you're thinking about what your audience are, their motivations, and what you can do that will help them out in this time and relate to what they actually need. And I think that going back to those interpretive things like themes can really help you do that. So, if you have any questions for me, you can go ahead and leave them in the Q&A box, and I would be happy to answer your questions as we go along. All right, so that concluded my section of this presentation. I hope that was at least a little bit helpful. I also, you know, hope that we're all able to get over our panic. At least I'm still a little bit panicked, but we've got this, guys. We're gonna be okay. So Karen is up next with her presentation. So Karen, I will send it over to you.
All right. So we're going to take some of those same principles that Catherine was talking about, and we are going to apply them to the things that we write and figure out how they might change what we write. So next slide. In your chat box, I want you just to write down what kinds of things you write in your job now. Just quick, write those, type those in there for me. Oh, there we go. Okay, so exhibit labels. Newsletter articles, yes, the fun newsletter articles. Social media posts, marketing brochures, instruction manuals. Oh, I like that one. Direct mail copy, good. Program descriptions, you're going to see a couple of those. Good. Donor communications, good. So what I want you to do as you see next, Catherine, what I want you to look at as those are scrolling by is the huge variety of things that we write. And as you look at those, some of those you're going to think of as being interpretive, creative kind of things in the first place. And that's going to be your newsletter articles, your exhibit panel text, those sorts of things. Those are going to kind of automatically be things you think of as sort of interpretive. And other things you probably think of as being a little bit more along the lines of just informational. And those might be reports and the instruction manuals that someone said, the grants, the list of rules for your site. But what I want us to look at is how some of those things, if we would write them more interpretively with those basic foundational concepts in mind, we will have greater involvement and engagement with our audience, whoever that is, because we've connected to that individual. One of the things is, before we go forward, that I do also want you to think about are a couple of differences between programs and writing. One of those big ones is that when someone is giving a program, you're attending a program, the guide may say something, or a video part goes by, something, you know, is said, and maybe you missed it or didn't hear it quite clearly. And if it's a live person who did it, you might be able to say, oh wait, what did you just say? Or, you know what, now I'm confused. What were you saying earlier and how does that relate? But in general, once it's said, if you didn't get it, it's kind of gone. In writing, people always can go back and read. They can go back and say, these didn't make sense. Let me go back and see what was said earlier. They can go back and say, oh, what was the point of this? Let me go back and see what they said again. So that's, and when you're writing things, I think that you need to keep in mind that people can always go back to what was written and double check, fact check, check their comprehension of it. And that's a little bit harder to do in something that is not written down. The other thing is to think about, because they can do that, is to pay attention to where you put themes. Themes are important. They're what keep the people connected, as Catherine's already said. And making sure that the theme is at the beginning of the written piece, that it is referred to a lot in the middle, and that it's again toward the wrap-up piece, and mentioning it frequently. Because as we write things, whether they're long or short, as we write them, we tend to kind of drift off into our factual mode and our informational mode, and they lose that connection. It's the same thing that happens in writing that often happens in programming. And so you want to kind of keep these principles. Am I being connected? Am I pulling up these universals to connect people to things? So next. One of the things that you said that you wrote, I call them blurbs, program blurbs. And those are the things that you write for, you want people to sign up for a course, it's for a special event, You want people to sign up for, but it's that little 2 or 3 sentence thing that's supposed to pique curiosity and make people go, yep, I want to do that. So this is just one I pulled from a summer course being offered, a summer camp being offered this year. We have permission of the organization for the examples that I used. And so this is for obviously 1st to 3rd grade program on superheroes. And you know, it's got a lot of great questions and that sort of thing. And I want us to look at it and see what the elements that we said were foundational can we find in here. So in terms of tangibles, those things that you can relate to through your 5 senses, there's a lot in this one. We've got bee and insect and honey and spider and web and bats and owls. Those are all very concrete, tangible things. We also have some intangibles, with the idea of superpowers and discovering and nature in the big sense, not as referring to nature itself. So those are some intangibles, things that are kind of concepts and big lofty idea things that we might not all have exactly the same idea of. There's a universal in there, power. Everybody understands power in some shape or form. We all understand it. But then when we start to look at theme on this one, there isn't really a theme. I look at it and I see a list of superheroes and superpowers. That's kind of the topic. That's what it's going to be about. But, and it's sort of a list of those. And the so what does it mean to me? Not a whole lot. Intriguing questions, and it might be curious to me, you know, might spark some curiosity, but it's pretty easy to read this and then say, okay, next, what's next? So next slide. If we add just a couple sentences to this, then we answer, so we start to pull in some of those other foundational pieces. The tangibles stayed the same because I didn't change any of that wording. The intangibles are the same. The universals, there's another one added in this version, comparison at the end, so the idea of comparing things. But now we have a theme. We have a theme that the natural world has superheroes. That's actually the words used right there, right at the very beginning. The third, you know, the first statement is a theme statement. And then the so what? How does it matter to me? You've asked me, how do I compare? How do I fit into, what are my superpowers and how do I compare and fit into the natural world? So there's a way that I'm pulled into this and that it matters to me. Now, one person asked a question early on for exhibit text, which we're not going to speak to specifically in this session, but the answer is here. She said, what about when you're putting all this information into exhibit labels? And here the same thing comes up. You don't want these blurbs to be, you know, 6 pages long. They're just a few sentences. So what do you do when space becomes an issue? And I encourage you to really look at the taking out examples rather than taking out any of the foundational elements. So making sure that you have the connections and the meanings and the themes, the things that people can really grab onto and relate to themselves, and leave out examples that are just maybe neat. In this case, on this one, I might leave out why do bats and owls have supervision, or I might leave out who runs the fastest in order to shorten it down, but to keep in the elements that really are going to connect and make people feel like this is for me. So that's looking at all kinds of program blurbs. Next. Somebody mentioned, several people mentioned that they write communication with donors and donor letters. So these are the first two paragraphs, they're actually only 2 sentences, from a donor letter that I just got a few, maybe 3 weeks ago. This is exactly what it is. And if, again, I look at those foundational pieces that we've talked about, the audience in this one could be almost anybody because it was just $25. So we weren't looking at rich people. We were looking at people who had, you know, small amounts of disposable money. The tangibles in this are money, date, the building that you're helping to sponsor, and then the community that you're that this brings you to into. Intangibles, ideas of contribution, and then the intangibles in this one get pretty lofty. Eco-friendly, teachable moments, outdoor education, environmentally sustainable practices. The intangibles in this one are definitely intangible, and they happen to kind of be field specific. The vocabulary is very field specific. So some people who donated might or might not even know exactly what those intangibles were. The universals were the idea of giving a gift or contribution and community. In terms of a theme statement in this, there really isn't one. There's a topic of thank you, but there's not any real theme to it. And the so what is, well, at least you're acknowledging my support, so you have connected to me a little bit that way. But with just a few changes in some wording, next slide, we can increase some of those foundational aspects. So it starts right away with the word you. And I'm going to jump right at that. What you're talking right to me. And excuse me. And something that I just did with my donation, in this case, it was in an environmental ed center. I just removed invasive species from a square foot of land. Oh my goodness. That's exactly, you know, I now know what I did. You've connected right to me. If you're in a different kind of environment, you can use different sorts of examples there. You might be that you supported a child in summer camp or through one day of summer camp, or you just allowed a collection object to be preserved or to be acquired. So there's, you know, making that very specific. And then it went on to the same words that were there, you know, thank you for your contribution. The amount, you want that right at the front because this is also going to be their tax letter that they put, you know, when they do their taxes. So it's still right at the beginning, but we started with a strong so what. Then the other thing that in this type of donor letter, you can't just send out one form to everybody. Ideally, you would say, you'd set up your merging and sorting program so that donations, you know, of $25 to $50 had a letter that said this is what it did, something that within that price range, and then another letter for, you know, 100 to 500, and this is what your contribution did, so that people were getting something that was totally equal to the amount of money they gave. It made sense. And then you can change those examples throughout the year or for different kinds of fundraising events, so that they always are seeing, wow, look what my money did. This is what it did. And that's where we get to our theme. While it isn't specified in this, we don't always say our theme exactly in our presentations or writing. The theme that comes out, the message, the thing that hits you in the head on this is you made a difference. And the so what is, you know, the money that you gave made a clearly defined impact on this organization. So donor letters are a great place to think about the foundations of interpretation. I did a training for a zoo out here, and they were everybody, all, no matter who you were, if you worked at the zoo, whether you were concessions, development, keepers, everybody had to take this interpretation course that I taught. And after it was over, it was the development officer who came to me and said that because of that course, she had totally changed her donor letters so that they were interpretive and had these elements in it. So it can make a big impact there. Another example, next slide, is the rules of your organization. So these are trail rules, and they called them property guidelines. And these were the list. Hopefully in your museums, if you're representing a museum, no fires is not one you have to post out there for people. But anyway, these were their lists, and you come up to it at the beginning of the trailhead, and this is what you see, and it's pretty typical. I look at it and I say, yeah, same old rules. I know them, and I just kind of go, I'm going to behave the way I always behave because those are always the same rules. But and there are tangibles in there. I mean, the audience is everybody on the trail. The tangibles in there are fires and litter and trash and trails and pets and leashes. Those are some of the tangibles that are listed in there. Intangibles, natural objects, living things, the idea of carrying things out. The universals, if you get that far, are down at the bottom. They're respect and fun. The theme, not a theme in this one, just a list of rules and how they expect you to behave. And the so what, again, you have to kind of read through the whole sign. You get down to the end, and the so what is that you might have fun here. If you follow all these things, geez, you might have fun. If we rewrite this in a totally different way, our next slide shows us some things here. And this is the first thing people are going to say is, oh my, this has got so many words on it. And I totally agree with you. This isn't necessarily exactly the way I would put it up there. But when you start to look at it, it also is going to capture you to do a little bit more reading of it and not just say, oh, this is all the same stuff. Because immediately you're talking to me. You are entering a sanctuary. You are entering a very special place. It is a home. And so now our tangibles have increased. We have the same ones we had before, fire, litter, trash, because the rules are the same, but we've added home and plants and animals and pebbles and twigs. We've added a bunch of tangibles. Intangibles, besides what we had before, is sanctuary and stealing. That's a new one in there. Universals, besides what we had before, respect and fun, we have the idea of being a visitor, of a sanctuary, of children, destruction, and using our senses. So now we have a theme in this one. You are a visitor in a special place, or you are a visitor in a sanctuary. And now we have a theme. This is something I'm going to remember. And you've spoken to me right away. I'm going to now look at those things because you've connected to me. You've brought in that so what. As you read that first paragraph, you've talked about, I expect visitors in my home to be respectful of my things. So now I am a visitor somewhere else. I need to be respectful of the home of other, in this case, plants and animals. So we've made a connection. We've used those basic foundational pieces and changed the way we present our rules. People will tend to read it more, and then this sign is actually being done to do some passive education. So it's taking the rules and how do we take rules and do some passive education. So that's why it's a little bit more wordy than some trails, but the idea also illustrates some of the foundational pieces of interpretation that we were talking about today. If you're in a museum setting that you want to think about these, your rules maybe do not touch or stay off the rail. The idea is the same. You want to start to focus on, what do these rules mean to me? Why do I care about these rules, instead of making these rules just the rules of the place they're in? And that's just a little switch of your own brain and how you're thinking about them, but it can make a really big difference in how it relates to your visitor and your guest. Now, the other things that a lot of people mentioned, and this is just a quick view, applying those rules to writing, is that think about other things that you mentioned that you write. Think about Facebook posts. I look at a lot of Facebook posts that are just announcements of upcoming events. How can you change that announcement to connect to the people reading it, so that when they read it, they're like, oh yes, this means something to me, this matters to me, and not make it just a kind of an announcement. That happens a lot on Facebook. Some of you, I think, said you had to write committee reports or board reports to the board. How can you connect that report? I get reports and I look at them, I say, oh, here's a report, and I stick it in the file and think I'll read it sometime. What if your first couple of sentences had a theme and had a so what message to it, and how it connected to those committee members or the person receiving that report? How many more of those reports might get read at least a little bit further on, because now it connected to that audience? Another big one where you can make a difference is grants. When you write grants, if you know who the grant, what they like to fund, what their concerns are, do a little research into that granting agency, and you apply these foundational principles in your first couple of paragraphs, and then hopefully at different sections throughout the grant application, they're going to give it to you. They're like, you know us, you understand us, you know, whoa, you just pulled them right in. You just put your grant application way ahead of others. It's a great place to use these foundational pieces. Let's see. So the other thing is that the more you practice these things, the better it'll get. Sometimes it's hard to think of the words and ways to put it together, but the more you write it, the more you practice it, and the more you try it, the better you'll get at finding the right words and the better at applying them, and it'll start to come faster. So these are just the things for you to think about in terms of all the different kinds of writing you do and ways to make them more more engaging and get more connection, and you'll have more compliance, more participation from your users, from your audience. So for me now, if you have other questions, feel free. There's one here. So how do you keep it short and do this approach to interpretive writing? My blurb was actually with interpretively, the blurb I gave you could be exactly the same number of words, because I would have dropped a couple of examples for the sentences I added. It would have been exactly the same. This trail one is actually, this rule one is actually in the process of being developed. And so there would be some more word crafting to do, but because it relates to people, they're going to read it more. We'll do some tests of those and see what we need to add and change. And because it's worded differently than you normally see rules written, people are going to read it just to see, well, how do they say this? How do they explain that? And so there's going to be some interesting things in that to see how it actually does play out, and what kind of, do we have less dog poop on the trails? Will be a real key piece for us to see if this has an impact that way. You just have to be willing to give up some of your wordiness. You can also just shorten the way you say things, and that will help reduce the number of words that are used in a sign. I don't know if that helps you any, but any other questions for me? Okay, then I think you've heard Catherine and I talking about interpretation and the foundations and all that. Emily is going to talk to you a little bit about how you can get this background knowledge for yourself.
All right. Well, thank you to Karen and to Catherine. I'm really actually quite pleased and delighted to be here today. Though our office is in Fort Collins, Colorado, I actually live in Washington State. And so, like so many things that have been happening recently, if it wasn't for COVID-19, I wouldn't be able to join you today. So I appreciate the invitation, and I'm just going to chat a little bit about NAI. I'm not sure how many of you even have heard of us before or know that there's a professional association for interpretation. I know a couple of you are certified as guides, and I was asked to come and talk a little bit about who we are and then talk a bit about certification. So this is fairly short, but just to give you a little bit of an introduction. So if we start with who we are, of course, we are a professional association for interpreters, primarily in the United States. We are the national association, although we certainly have members all over the world. So we have about 7,000 members right now. They come from mostly North America, but we do have interpreters that are professionals that are part of our association that live in Indonesia or in Siberia. What do we do as a professional association? Well, probably like CWAM, we offer all sorts of different things: professional development, conferences, certifications. So if we talk a little bit about professional development, there's sort of our three categories, and you can see those on the slide. We have workshops, and if you can click the mouse for me, Catherine, these are just some examples of workshops. So these are not connected to certification. They're things that build upon your skills. So Catherine gave a really nice description of how she plans an interpretive program. What if you wanted to know more about planning interpretation at your entire museum? Well, we have a course. It's a 5-day-long workshop. It used to be taught face-to-face. We'll see what happens now with the pandemic, but a class that really gives you an opportunity to dig into and know more about interpretive planning. We have a class on interpretive design and a workshop called Social Interp that talks about design and also social media. We have a workshop about coaching. So what is the difference between coaching and supervision? How might that look different? We, of course, have online learning and networking. That part of our association has really grown over the last couple of weeks for obvious reasons. We have webinars like this that happen twice a month. One that is geared each month towards the field professional, so someone who's still in the field, maybe giving tours of a museum. But then we also try to have one at least once a month that is a little bit for folks who may no longer be in the field, but maybe on interpretive management or interpretive planning, supervision, volunteer management, that kind of thing. We have a relationship with the Epley Institute for Parks and Public Lands, and we have a couple of certificates online, including one called Interpretive Methods. And then we've started a number of networking things. NAI twice a week has something called Interp Talk, which is specifically all about getting interpreters together and talking with each other and just learning. So today we were talking about virtual engagement. How are you engaging with your visitors when your facilities are closed? And then we also had a conversation as people are starting to reopen, what does that look like? And it was everything from cleaning procedures to, are your staff wearing masks? To, are you doing any interpretive programs? So Interp Talk, and then we also have that I think is going to phase out by the end of May. We have a virtual happy hour on Friday. So if you want to come and just talk with other people who do this work, but maybe you don't want to talk about COVID-19, it's a good opportunity to do that. We also have a book club. We read books, 6 books a year. Sometimes we have an opportunity to actually meet with the authors. So for example, we're reading this book right now. It just happens to be on my bookcase, Interpreting Cultural and Natural Heritage. It's upside down or backwards with my webcam, but we're actually then going to meet with the authors next week. And so they're gonna talk with us. We've read books like, I'm sure many of you may be familiar with Nina Simon and her work in museums. So we read Nina's most recent book, The Art of Relevance, and then she came and chatted with us. So most of the things that I've listed on this slide, some are free, some are for a fee, but certainly there's always a benefit if you're a member. So if you're a member, a lot of these things have a discount rate. So thank you, Catherine. Let's go to the next slide. Because we're a professional association, we also offer publications. Literally today, I got Legacy Magazine, which is a magazine all about interpretation from across the country. Next slide, please. We have our own publishing firm, our own publishing house, and so we do publish books that are unique to the profession. So some of you said you're doing exhibits. For example, the Interpreting by Design book is all about exhibits. Not to the same level that maybe some of you are familiar with, like Beverly Searley's book, I think that's her last name, called Exhibit Labels, but just overall interpretive design. How do I use color interpretively? What is typeface? How does that communicate who we are? So we have a number of resources ourselves that we publish. And then next slide. And then because we are a professional association, we of course really believe in research. And so we do publish a couple of times a year a journal of interpretive research. And as a member, that's something that is delivered to you. Next slide. We have conferences. So just like you all were planning to meet together with CWAM, we obviously also have conferences. So we have a national workshop that happens each year, usually in November. We have regional, so within our membership, for example, many of you, if you live in Colorado or Washington, or excuse me, I live in Washington, Colorado or Wyoming, you live in a particular region of the country. And so sometimes people that are geographically close to each other will have a regional workshop, usually in the spring. Our membership is also divided by interest. So we have sections. You can belong to the tourism section. You can belong to the interpretive media section, and they have conferences. And then we also have specialty conferences. So just last week, we hosted a workshop that we've had annually for a couple of years, usually face-to-face in partnership with California State Parks at one of their sites, but we did it virtually. And it was all about using technology in interpretation, which of course is so relevant to people right now. Next slide. So that's kind of the heart of what, when we think of a professional association, probably a lot of the things that I've talked about so far didn't surprise you, but we also have certification. And while I talk a little bit about certification, I know there are 5 of you who are certified as guides, and I'd love for you to just type into the chat box, why? Like, what made you decide to become certified? And that might just be interesting for us as a group. So these are just 4 of the 6 certifications that we have, but Catherine, if you can go to the next slide for me. Our certifications are divided into 2 categories. So we have training level certifications. These are ones that people attend a physical workshop for. And the idea, for example, those who are certified interpretive guides, you only had to be 16 years old and breathing. That's the only prerequisites for CIG. Certified interpretive host, that's CIH, is for everyone else at your site, people that don't consider themselves interpreters. But it's NAI's way of recognizing that a museum visitor may end up talking with the person who collected their admission fee, the person in your retail shop, someone in maintenance, far more than they talk to the curators or to the quote unquote interpreters at the site. So how can those people understand that they're part of telling the interpretive story and they're connected to the mission? So we have 2 training level, and then we have 4 professional level certifications. And these are people that have been in the field. So for example, Catherine and Karen, who are both with me today, are both certified as interpretive trainers. So they have demonstrated their competence in training, which we obviously could see even in a virtual landscape. But you can certify as an interpretive planner, trainer, manager, or also something called a heritage interpreter. None of those require a workshop. You just submit paperwork almost like a portfolio, and then it goes through a peer review process. Next slide. So when we think about what type of certification we are, we do have a little grid here, a flow chart of sorts. If you're thinking about being certified and you're not quite sure what type of certification might work for you, part of why NAI has a certification is because that's what professions do. You know, across the field, there are so many types of people who call themselves interpreters. There are docents who might volunteer at your facility 1 hour a week or 1 day a week, all the way through people who might have a PhD in interpretation. And all of them really are interpreters, but how do we account for the level of interpreters they might be? And so much like the medical profession, of course, you can get certified, you're a doctor or a lawyer, we have our own certification. So this flow chart, which you might have been looking at while we've been talking through, you know, you may go through and say, okay, yep, my job is interpretation. Maybe it's written interpretation. You're not giving tours, but you're doing exhibits. You're doing tours, all of that kind of stuff. Karen just talked about she loves sharing 1860s property through hands-on. So she would say, yes, I'm an interpreter. And then what type of interpreter am I? Am I new to the field? Yes, then I might want to become a certified interpretive guide. Am I not new to the field? No. So you just kind of flow this through and you can kind of get a sense of where you might lie in our continuum of certifications. Next slide, please. We know from our folks, and it looks like the chat was temporarily broken. So those of you who are CIGs, if you want to jump in and type into the chat now about why you chose to get certified, I'd love to hear from you. But we know that there are some benefits that people have told us. Long before I worked for NAI, I was in the field of interpretation for about 20 years, mostly in the National Park Service. And I became certified partially because of this first one. I knew that it would help to build my credibility. Next, please. We know that people also like to certify because it encourages lifelong learning. You know, unlike some other programs, you're not a CIG forever. You get your CIG and you need to submit 40 hours of continuing ed every 4 years. So you get to guide that journey of what the continuing ed looks like, but it really encourages you to have this lifelong learner sort of mentality. We know in this next bullet that it increases the potential for promotion. There are a number of sites all across the country, museums, parks, zoos, aquariums, that require certification or even give people, they make more. It might just be a 10 cents an hour, but it still is an additional incentive. Next slide, please. We know that people feel great accomplishment from it. I'm amazed at the number. When I was in the interpretive field as a practitioner, the last place I worked was Yosemite. And when I would be hiring staff, I was always amazed at how many people submitted in their resumes and they put like CIG right on the top next to their name. And it's because they were proud that they were certified with the organization. We give people pins, and oftentimes I see people with a pin on their lapel, or organizations have actually advocated to get their uniform standards changed so that they can wear their pin because that's how proud they are. Next, please. And then we also know that the field of interpretation is something that you need to learn. So kind of like Tilden's principles that Catherine shared at the beginning, one of his principles talks how interpretation is an art, and like many arts, it's teachable. And so we know that as people have gone through our program, they've been better interpreters. They've been better museum guides. They've written better exhibit labels because they figured out a way to connect more with their visitor and not just give them information, but give them connection. Okay, next. there also are a bunch of benefits to the profession. And Catherine, I'll just have you click a couple of times so we can go through all of them. But we know that here are just some examples of why professions would want to have interpretation, or sorry, have certification. There's high performance standards, it's peer reviewed, there's continuous improvement, and it's supported by research. So those are all things that sort of help to support and make interpretation as itself something that's more credible. The interpretation word is not something that people usually use. I'm the primary trainer for the organization, and I'm doing a lot of training classes all across the country. I spend a lot of my time typically on an airplane. And when I'm sitting on an airplane, I always make sure I'm wearing a branded piece of clothing. So if my luggage doesn't make it, I can at least show up for the first day of class looking somewhat official. And right on my chest here is the logo. It says the National Association for Interpretation. And I'm sure it doesn't surprise you when I sit down next to people, if they happen to ask me, the next question they ask is, what language do you speak? And so having this idea that interpretation is a profession, yes, there are sign language interpreters, there are language interpreters, but we are heritage interpreters, and we are really translating and connecting. All right, next slide. So what are some people saying? I have some quotes here about why people have certified, but I actually really love to see what's been offered in the chat as well. So Candace says, I love the program. I took it early in my career and it made me better at my job. I even incorporate some of those principles in an intro to museum studies course I teach. That's awesome. That's awesome, Candace. Thank you. This person talked about, just like we talked about, they need to know that an interpreter means something, that I won't take the audience's attention for granted. And it's a responsibility that I had, that I made to myself and to my audience. Next slide. Here's somebody else, about 8 years at a docent at what he called the world's best dinosaur museum. He did the training to understand and to use interpretation and to incorporate themes. So we're not just giving visitors fact after fact after fact, we're actually telling a story that relates and connects to them. And as he says right here, having a theme for my tour made this much more coming together of what I had to say and what connected with my audience. He still struggles with themes, don't we all? But the CIG training put him on the right track. So the last thing that I want to share is just, if you're interested in being certified, there is a calendar of workshops. As I said, our primary means of communication has typically in the past been face-to-face, but we did just launch a virtual offering. And so only for the last 2 weeks have people been able to take the Certified Interpretive Guide in a virtual space. And we're also talking about putting other certifications online. So that's something that if we continue to not be in a place where we can meet physically, we still want to be able to support people along their path towards interpretation. All right, next slide. So now what I thought we might do, and Catherine, maybe you even want to stop sharing your screen. We can all come on webcam and you can ask questions that might be specific to what I just covered about NAI or certification, or really questions for any of us. So what kinds of things are you curious about? We did such a good job. Nobody has anything for us.
We either answered all the questions or
Oh, it does look like something's just come into Q&A.
how long does it take to get CIG?
So the course itself is 32 hours typically. Now that it is online, what's happening is it's not quite that much class time, because the way we're currently teaching it is there are a series of online courses, and it takes about 6 hours to take the courses, and then you still would be meeting with your instructor, because CIGs need to give a 10-minute interpretive talk as part of their certification, but it could be about anything. It could be about this teapot that you're super passionate about in your museum. It could be about why your dog is the most incredible creature on the planet. We're really flexible about content because we're trying to teach you process. But typically, most of the time, it's a week long or 4 days long. And in a virtual landscape, it's a little less than that. Any other questions?
You've answered everything, apparently.
That can't possibly be true. Maybe these folks are like me and that this is my 4th Zoom meeting of the day and they just don't have any mental capacity left, which I completely respect and understand.
It's true.
Emily, somebody asked what the costs are.
So it depends upon so if we're still talking certification, it's going to depend upon the workshop and the certification that you take. So if you are ready to certify professionally, so you say, I'm already a trainer, I just want to be recognized by NAI for my training skills. So if you're just going to be a trainer, you're not going to train our stuff like CIG or CIH. It's $125 to apply if you're a member, $200 if you're not. If you're going through our training level credentials, so like the guide, which is what we're the most known for, it's $380 a person. That includes your certification, all the materials, whether it's virtual or face-to-face. And the only time, sometimes it's a little less than that, less than $380, but typically that's because you know your instructor, so you're not paying the instructor fee. Yeah. It's okay.
I was gonna say, speaking from experience, the town of Windsor just paid to certify all of our museum staff members who were working with the public. So we were able to make a case for that. So maybe if any of you have ideas on, the best way to kind of sell the program to your employer as a good investment.
Yes, I convinced my museum in Kansas City to send me to Virginia for our certified interpretive trainer training, and I had to write a whole justification for like what it would do. And it really is just, being certified gives your museum that credibility. It ensures, even to the board, that your programs and what you're doing has a certain level of credibility to them, that it's meeting a certain level of what your program should be doing. So I do have several justifications for that if anyone's interested in getting them from me. But every organization I've worked at, I was trained, by the Aspen Historical Society because they paid for all their interns to become certified guides. So I think it's not easy, but a lot of organizations are willing to sponsor certification.
Absolutely. And I think addition to what Catherine has shared, I know my first entree into at least the CIG was when I worked in Yosemite. I actually worked for, this kind of speaks to the other question that's in the chat box. I worked for the concession. So I was running an interpretive program. We did a lot of work that you would expect the Park Service to do. And we still did walks and talks and that kind of classic naturalist. But I was teaching the CIG to bus drivers, mule drivers, people that did not consider themselves interpreters. And I was able to get buy-in from my organization to say, it's all about telling a good story. The better stories that we can tell, the stronger connections visitors will have. Of course, then I would say, and then they want to come back and stay in our hotels. They want to buy more souvenirs, all that kind of stuff. And then I also sold it even to the participants. And I told them that even they were required to be in this training, but I said, I promise you, you will get better tips, because they were in that kind of environment, and they did. And so that as a CIG instructor, through our host program, where you again have like maintenance workers, front desk workers that may not consider themselves interpreters, they really talk about the value of seeing that what they do matters and that it's all connected to supporting the mission of the organization. And so they really feel like many people work at our facilities not because of the lavish amounts of money that they take home every day. They might do something that's not glamorous because they really care about our train depot or whatever it is, even though they're quote unquote just a maintenance person. And so this gives them an opportunity to learn the part that they play and how important it is that they share their story. Catherine or Karen, would you answer anything in addition to that?
No, I totally agree with that. And she was asking about underwriting portions of certification. So I do the winter training for the naturalists at the Aspen Center for Environmental Ed every winter. And I know that was interesting, Catherine. And their boss, he already believes in the program, but he splits the cost. So he pays the instructor cost and the workbook cost. And then and encourages them to get certified, but they pay the certification fee. So there's a place where they split the costs. And the idea being that he's giving them all the foundational, the professional development part of it, and certification goes with them wherever they go, whether they stay there or not, so they can pay for that piece of it. But he encourages them to do it, but there's a portion kind of sharing cost arrangement.
Todd asked how much the host training is. It's the same cost as the guide. So it's $380 if people get certified. People can also just take the class without certification, and then it's $230.
All right, last chance for questions. So once again, this webinar was recorded. For now, it will just be available through Zoom. We are working on getting everything posted on the QAM website so that you'll be able to watch them there. The last thing that I ask is whenever you leave this webinar, you will see a link to take our sort of post-webinar survey. So if you have, it's about 5 questions, just seeing how you found out about our webinar and what kinds of webinars you would like to see from QAM in the future. There's also a section there where you can sign up to receive our e-newsletter if you want to learn more about our events and other future webinars like this. I see no more last minute questions, so I just want to say thank you to all of our wonderful presenters today. And their information will be available. Some last things are coming up. Oh, that was from Emily. Okay. Right. So it does behoove you to have an online or an on-site instructor. We're lucky we have Catherine with us. And just as a fun fact, I very recently completed, well, I guess I didn't officially complete my CIG training, but I'm waiting to submit my final materials, and we were sort of an experimental online training.
Yes,
so
you were, Laura.
Yeah. So
they
our
got
first
stuck in the middle of the pandemic and went, how are we going to finish this? So
yeah, but it went really well, and I have been in the museum education field for 10 years, and I learned so much about the practice. And I think even though I don't do a lot of education and interpretation anymore, I learned so much just about how to communicate with other people and with our audiences. So I definitely recommend, you know, getting involved with interpretation.
right. Well, I thank you all for joining, and I thank the presenters for asking me to join with you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
All righty. I'm going to end this, so I will catch you all at the next webinar.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Laura. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.